Welcome back to the deep dive. It is so great to have you with us today.
Yeah, really great to be here.
Because, well, today we are tackling a massive, multi-layered intellectual collision. I mean, imagine stepping up to a microphone, boldly claiming to defend traditional biblical family values and advocating for a strict moral order to protect your culture.
Right.
And then, as you lay out your foundational logic, someone points out that your arguments perfectly align with the exact strategies used by the Pharaoh who enslaved the Israelites. You think you're defending the covenant, but you are actually providing the blueprints for Egypt.
It is a staggering historical irony. And it happens when someone adopts the vocabulary of a worldview without actually understanding its mechanical framework.
Exactly. So today we are unpacking a live debate that happened on YouTube regarding morality, feminism, and biblical history. In one corner, we have a Trinitarian apologist named Andrew Wilson.
And in the other corner, a liberal guest wearing a Make America Gay Again hat.
Yeah. But more importantly, we aren't just reacting to their debate. We are examining a rigorous, systematic deconstruction of that exact debate by a third party, an independent theological and historical analyst named Doug Bendo, or just Doug.
Right, and Doug brings what he calls the deep think protocol to this exchange. He's operating on a completely different analytical plane than either of the two men in the original video.
Definitely. And before we go any further, I want to explicitly state the ground rules for you, the listener. If you are looking to find people shouting over each other, well, you won't find that here. Plenty of other channels do that.
Oh yeah, tons of them.
Right. This is a rigorous analytical breakdown of the debate between two opposing parties. We are deciding who actually won based strictly on who has the most exhaustible, strongest chain of logic. This is a one versus one logical audit matching Doug against Andrew Wilson using the primary source materials.
And I need to step in here and provide a really crucial caveat for you as we proceed. The sources we're looking at today contain highly politically charged content.
Very charged.
Yeah, they span the extremes of right-wing traditionalism and left-wing progressivism, and they touch on some incredibly sensitive, volatile topics. We're going to be discussing historical slavery, social engineering, eugenics, and interpretations of biblical mandates. So I want to be explicitly clear, neither of us is taking any political sides today.
Exactly.
We are impartially reporting on the content provided. We're not endorsing the viewpoints of Andrew, the guest, or Doug. We're simply conveying the ideas and the logical chains contained in the original source material to see whose arguments actually survive a rigorous stress test.
Thank you for setting that boundary. It is vital. We are auditors today, not activists. So let's look at how this begins. We start with what looks like, a surface-level YouTube skirmish. Andrew Wilson challenges his liberal guest on the fundamental nature of morality. He wants to know if the guest believes morality is objective, meaning it exists outside of human opinion, or if it's merely a preference.
Meaning it's just whatever a group of people agree upon at any given time.
Right. And Andrew sets a very classic, very effective philosophical trap here. He pushes the guest into a corner using an extreme hypothetical.
Yeah, he proposes a scenario where a democratic society decides by a 99.9% consensus that marrying 13-year-olds is perfectly acceptable. And then he asks the guest a direct question. Under your worldview, what moral standing would you have to object to that society's decision?
And reading the transcript, you can almost physically feel the panic set in for the guest. I mean, the guest starts scrambling, arguing that 13-year-olds aren't old enough to consent, that their brains aren't developed.
But Andrew simply tightens the vice. He asks, if the consensus of society believes consent is no longer a requirement, what makes you morally correct and 99.9% of society morally incorrect?
Boom. The logic bottoms out right there.
It completely bottoms out because the guest has rejected any objective higher standard of morality. He has no shared axiom of being under God, so he has no external anchor. He can only rely on tautologies.
Let's break down the mechanics of a tautology for a moment, because it's the specific mechanism of the guest's failure here. A tautology is essentially defining a thing by simply restating the thing.
Precisely. When Andrew presses him on why a horrific act sanctioned by the majority is wrong, the guest responds by saying, it's wrong, it's abusive, it's harmful, and it's bad.
Just listing synonyms.
Yeah, he is attempting to prove the wrongness of an action by just listing synonyms for the word wrong.
It's bad because it's bad. It completely lacks an explanatory mechanism. According to the source text, Andrew explicitly points out that from the guest's secular worldview, human rights are only justified because the individual happens to like them.
Right.
If you remove an objector standard, every single person becomes their own ultimate arbiter of right and wrong. So the guest is forced to concede that if the societal consensus goes against his personal preferences, he has no grounding to critique the morality of anyone, anywhere, ever.
It is a devastating localized victory for Andrew. The guest flees from defining an ultimate standard because he just lacks the philosophical architecture to do so.
Yeah.
And this is exactly where Doug's commentary enters our source material. Doug analyzes this exchange and concludes that the guest is, well, in his words, a theological clown.
Now, that sounds like a typical internet insult, but Doug is using it as a technical diagnosis, isn't he?
He is, yeah. Doug's point is that the guest completely lacked the theological grammar to define his own terms. He walked into a high-stakes debate about the foundations of Western morality without understanding the historical or biblical definitions of the concepts being weaponized against him.
Right.
He was philosophically unarmed, making him an easy target for rhetorical dismantling.
Okay, let me push back on this for a second. If I'm watching this debate as a neutral observer, Andrew clearly wins this round. It's like bringing a butter knife to a fencing match. The guest couldn't defend his position. But doesn't that heavily imply that Andrew's foundational logic, his defense of traditional objective morality, is actually sound?
Well, that is the seductive nature of debate formats. Winning a localized skirmish against an incompetent opponent creates the illusion of foundational soundness. But Doug argues no, that's not the case.
Really?
Yeah. Doug argues that while Andrew can effortlessly expose a liberal secularist's lack of grounding, Andrew's own grounding is built on historical and theological sand.
Wow. And this pivots the entire deep dive. Because when the debate topic shifts to the Old Testament, the real logical audit begins. The liberal guest attempts to attack the Bible by claiming it justifies slavery. Andrew immediately goes on the defensive, but his defense utilizes a very specific framework.
He argues that in the ancient Near East, biblical slavery was essentially a merciful alternative to extermination. He frames it specifically around prisoners of war.
The POW defense.
Right. According to Andrew's argument, if you defeat an enemy nation in antiquity, you face three grim options. You can exterminate them, you can let them go to rebuild their armies and fight you again, or you can intern them and extract labor. Andrew frames this POW slavery as a pragmatic, moral middle ground.
And in a vacuum, it sounds rational. It sounds like the lesser of two evils. But Doug steps in and identifies a massive categorical error in Andrew's reasoning.
Huge error.
Doug argues that Andrew is taking two entirely different historical mechanisms, Trinitarian chattel slavery and Hebraic covenantal servitude, and just mashing them together to win a debate point.
Exactly. Doug explains that what the liberal guest was actually reacting to, and rightfully disgusted by, was the concept of chattel slavery. That is the system where a human being is legally stripped of their humanity, categorized as livestock, and treated as absolute inheritable property.
Right.
However, because the guest lacked theological grammar, he wrongly attributed the mechanics of chattel slavery to the Mosaic covenant.
But instead of correcting the guest by explaining actual biblical law, Andrew leans into the guest's false premise. He tries to defend a slightly modified, nicer version of chattel slavery using this POW narrative. So how does Doug actually define Hebraic covenantal servitude mechanically?
Well, based on the biblical texts, Doug outlines that the Hebraic model was not a POW internment camp. It functioned as an anti-poverty engine and a definitive social safety net. He points to the mechanics of the Jubilee and the laws of release.
Oh, right.
In the brutal economy of the ancient Near East, if a family fell into absolute destitution, their only options were starvation, exposure, or falling prey to predatory kidnapping.
So Hebraic servitude allowed a person to voluntarily enter a covenanted household. They could clear their debt, acquire a trade, and be guaranteed food, shelter, and medical care. It functioned more like a strict bankruptcy law than a human trafficking ring.
Furthermore, Doug highlights a crucial distinction. Under this Hebraic system, the servant retained bodily autonomy rights regarding physical abuse. This was rooted in the recognition of the imago Dei, the image of God. The system was meticulously designed to prevent the exact abuses that Andrew is inadvertently trying to rhetorically justify.
This is where Doug runs Andrew's POW theory through a historical stress test using the biblical record itself. And Doug presents two major historical counterexamples that demonstrate Andrew's logic simply cannot support its own weight. Let's look at the first one, the Joseph anomaly.
It is a brilliant audit of the biblical text. Andrew's entire model relies on slavery being a state-sanctioned, merciful military contingency. But look at the narrative of Genesis 37. Joseph was not a prisoner of war. There was no military conflict.
Right, his brothers were just jealous. They acted as rogue slave traders, ambushing a free man and selling him to Ishmaelite merchants for profit.
It was a conspiracy of kin, a clear case of extrajudicial human trafficking. Doug notes a critical contradiction here. Under the Mosaic law that was later codified in Exodus 21:16, kidnapping and man-stealing was explicitly a capital offense punishable by death.
So Andrew's POW model is acting as a rhetorical shield that completely ignores the reality of the ancient Near East. The slave trade wasn't a benevolent military strategy. It was largely fueled by greed, domestic betrayal, and predatory kidnapping, all of which biblical law explicitly condemned.
Then Doug applies the second historical test, and this one fundamentally inverts Andrew's entire worldview. Doug examines the Egyptian model from Exodus chapter 1.
Oh, here's where it gets really interesting for you, the listener.
Yeah. The enslavement of the Hebrews by the Egyptian Pharaoh had absolutely nothing to do with processing prisoners of war after a just conflict. It was pure demographic warfare.
Let's dig into the psychology of this because it connects directly to modern anxieties. Pharaoh looks at the Hebrew population and says, look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. He is terrified of a demographic shift.
Right.
He fears that this minority population will out-reproduce the native Egyptians and eventually ally with Egypt's enemies.
And in response to this fear, Pharaoh doesn't offer a path to merciful integration. He initiates state-sponsored slavery. And Doug emphasizes that this wasn't merely a quest for free labor, it was a strategy of attrition. The hard labor was mathematically designed to break their physical capability and lower their birth rates.
And when the hard labor didn't kill them fast enough, Pharaoh escalated to outright infanticide. Exodus 1 records Pharaoh ordering the midwives to murder the newborn Hebrew males.
Doug categorizes this policy as eugenics, or state-sponsored eugenics. It was a deliberate, systematic attempt to sever the male lineage of a specific demographic while presumably absorbing the females into the Egyptian population.
So let's connect the dots here. Doug points out a staggering theological irony regarding Andrew. In his broader apologetics and political commentary, Andrew frequently argues from a position of protecting his own culture from demographic shifts. His rhetoric often operates out of a fear of being overrun by outsiders.
According to Doug's analysis, by advocating for a system that subdues a minority group out of fear of a demographic shift, Andrew accidentally but perfectly aligns his logic with Pharaoh.
He is aligning with the ultimate villain of the Old Testament. I mean, Andrew is sitting in a debate, attempting to defend the Bible, while actually defending the very system of state-sponsored, fear-based subjugation that God sent 10 plagues upon Egypt to dismantle. When Doug applies actual biblical history to Andrew's claims, Andrew's internal consistency completely evaporates.
Exactly. And this moves Doug's critique beyond just historical examples. He begins to dismantle the very political theology Andrew is advocating for. Doug identifies that Andrew is pushing for a strongman model of social order.
Let's define that for a second. A strongman model is a pragmatic statism. It's the belief that society requires a powerful, centralized human authority to subdue threats, manage shifting demographics, and keep the economic machinery running, even if that machinery requires coercive labor.
To counter this, Doug takes the analysis straight to the book of 1 Samuel, specifically chapter 8. This is the pivotal, tragic moment in biblical history where Israel demands to transition from a theocracy where God is their direct sovereign to a human monarchy.
Right. The Israelites approach Samuel the prophet and explicitly demand a human king so they can be, quote, like all the nations.
To be like the Goyim, the surrounding pagan empires. Samuel responds with what Doug calls the Samuel warning. It is a terrifying technical breakdown of the exact mechanics of what a human king, the very strong man Andrew is defending, will actually do to the citizenry.
Samuel lists the mechanics of state extraction. He warns, he will take your sons and appoint them for himself. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks. He will take the best of your fields. It is a promise of systemic conscription and confiscation. And it culminates in 1 Samuel 8:17 with the ultimate price of a centralized state. He will take a tenth of your sheep, and you shall be his slaves.
Doug uses this to highlight a profound failure in Andrew's logic. Andrew advocates for the power to subdue others via a state apparatus, operating under the assumption that his preferred group will always be the ones holding the leash.
Right, the delusion of control.
Exactly. But the biblical logic demonstrates that desiring a state apparatus powerful enough to ruthlessly subdue your enemies inevitably creates an apparatus that will eventually subdue its own citizens. The exploitation you wish to wield against the outsider will ultimately be turned inward.
But I want to pause here because the source notes show Doug taking this into the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, and making an observation that is deeply unsettling. Doug observes that Andrew, in his zeal to control demographics and subdue strangers, is actually actively promoting the curses of the covenant rather than the blessings. How does that work mechanically?
To understand this, we have to unpack the hyperdimensional logic of Deuteronomy 28. This chapter outlines the binary reality of the covenant at Sinai. It promises total, systemic blessing for adherence to God's law and total, systematic collapse, the curses for disobedience. Doug points out that these curses are a detailed blueprint of societal entropy.
What are the specific mechanics of that entropy?
Well, they perfectly mirror the societal anxieties that drive Andrew's arguments. For example, verse 43 states, "The stranger that is within thee shall get up above thee very high, and thou shalt come down very low." It is the fear of the foreigner rising above the citizen becoming the tail and not the head.
Oh, wow.
And the climax of this curse is found in verse 68. "And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, and there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you."
To be sold into ships of iron with no redeemer.
So what does this all mean for Andrew's mercy argument? Doug's synthesis is that Andrew is attempting to engineer the blessing using human effort, coercion, and state violence. Andrew operates under what Doug terms the fear of the peer.
The fear of the peer.
Yeah. Andrew views the stranger, the shifting demographic, as a literal physical threat that must be checkmated and subdued through force.
But the biblical model of the blessing views the stranger differently, doesn't it?
Completely differently. The biblical model commands that the stranger be integrated and protected via the law of love and strict covenantal justice. Doug argues that Andrew's logic bottoms out because he is caught in an ideological trap. He believes he could utilize the tools of the covenant: curse suppression, subjugation, forced labor to artificially manufacture the blessings of the covenant, which is security and prosperity.
He is focusing on managing the physical symptoms of societal decline without addressing the spiritual root cause.
Exactly. Doug emphasizes that the curses in Deuteronomy do not fall upon Israel because they weren't alpha enough or because they failed to subjugate enough slaves. The curses are triggered because their hearts turned away from the absolute authority of the Creator and toward their own human preferences. By mimicking the kings of the nations, Doug argues that Andrew is adopting the mind of Egypt, and it is an ontological impossibility to use the methods of Egypt to protect the people of Sinai.
This brings us to what Doug calls the theological singularity. This is the point in the audit where Andrew's argument doesn't just fracture, it completely shatters. We are diving into the conflict between patrilineal truth and matriarchal fraud.
This is the deepest theological layer of Doug's deconstruction. Andrew frequently claims to be defending objective morality, and crucially for his broader worldview, he claims to be a staunch defender of patriarchy, the traditional father-led structure of the family and society.
But Doug, operating from a strict adherence to the biblical texts, defines the true Hebraic patrilineal standard in a way that completely invalidates Andrew's historical examples. And to understand Doug's critique here, we really have to understand Doug's underlying theology, because this is critical to note. Doug's argument is uniquely separate from the traditional Christian apologetics that Andrew uses.
Right. This is a vital distinction in the source material. Doug is not a Trinitarian. He follows a specific doctrine of the Father, based on the New Testament order of operations as laid out by Jesus, Peter, and Paul.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that order of operations because it's the foundation of everything Doug argues next about patriarchy.
Okay, so Doug views the nature of the Father as pure existence, the ultimate reality. The Father does not exist by a point of action, he simply just is, which is why he declares his name as I am, W-H-O, I am in Exodus.
Right, he is infinite, unchanging.
Exactly. And because he dwells in unapproachable light, direct, unmediated interaction with a finite, time-bound creation is impossible. He must use a bridge. He delegates action.
So he establishes a sovereign will from the beginning and chooses a specific servant.
Yes. The Father is the source. Jesus serves as the action, or the mediating conduit. And the Holy Spirit is the mechanism of connection. Doug points out that Jesus is the definitive upgrade from Old Testament prophets. Prophets like Moses or Elijah received messages, but they lacked the authority to pour out God's Spirit onto others.
Ah, I see.
Jesus was the first messenger specifically designated and authorized by the Father to baptize with the Holy Spirit without measure. He is the ultimate conduit.
And the proof of concept for this mechanism happens after the resurrection, right?
Yeah. The death and resurrection are the sign that the Father officially made him both Lord and Christ. When Peter preaches in Acts 2, he explicitly outlines this order. Jesus is exalted to the Father's right hand, receives the Holy Spirit from the Father, and pours it out. The resulting signs and wonders are the visible proof that this order of operations has been successfully executed. Through belief, believers are given the Holy Spirit.
And then this extends to the Gentiles through Paul. So the chain of delegation goes from the Father to Jesus to Paul to the Gentiles, bringing them into direct union with the Father.
Exactly. It is a strict, vertical flow of divine authority. And this vertical flow perfectly mirrors the social structure of the authentic biblical covenant at Sinai. Identity, land inheritance, and covenantal standing are strictly patrilineal. They flow from the Father. This is explicitly commanded in Numbers 1-2, where the census is calculated strictly by the house of their fathers.
It is a vertical, structural hierarchy designed to anchor the family lineage directly to the Creator.
Right.
Okay, so Andrew claims he loves patriarchy, but Doug audits the actual historical system. Andrew is defending the Roman Trinitarian colonial system of slavery, and Doug exposes a massive, deliberate inversion of biblical law by that very system.
To construct their massive plantation economies, the Roman systems and the later European colonial systems that Andrew defends had to actively destroy the biblical concept of patriarchy. They invented and enforced a matriarchal legal framework.
Which is wild.
Yeah. The defining legal doctrine was called partus sequitur ventrum.
Which translates to that which is brought forth follows the womb. The legal status of the child follows the mother, not the father.
We have to look at why they engineered this legal shift.
Yeah.
If you are operating a system of mass chattel slavery, it is an absolute historical certainty that the masters, the overseers, will father children with the enslaved women. If identity and inheritance are patrilineal, as biblical law dictates, those children would derive their status from their free fathers.
They would be free. They would have a legitimate legal claim to the estate.
Which would bankrupt the entire plantation system in a single generation.
Wow.
So to prevent that, they literally rewrote the foundational law of human identity. They shifted the source of identity from the father to the mother so they could legally harvest the native-born children as state property.
This specific legal inversion is what paved the way for the horrific historical realities of forced breeding farms and the practice known as buck breaking. The seed of the father no longer belonged to his own lineage. It was legally transferred to the master, or the state.
Right.
Doug argues this is the literal mechanical deconstruction of the patriarchy by a system that actively markets itself as patriarchal. It's a profound betrayal. It's like claiming you are the ultimate divinely appointed protector of a sacred forest while secretly passing legislation that allows you to harvest every single new sapling to feed your own lumber mill.
That's a great analogy.
You are destroying the very thing you claim to revere simply for profit. But Doug's historical accounting goes even deeper here. He introduces the concept of the state Jew proxy. Let's break down how that connects to this matriarchal legal fraud.
If we look at the broader picture of the Holy Roman Empire, the church faced a massive structural problem. They desperately needed what Doug calls ontological grounding. They claimed to be the direct, legitimate heirs of the biblical covenant, but they were building a global empire powered by a matriarchal slave law that explicitly contradicted the biblical mandate of patrilineal descent.
So, according to Doug's analysis, they needed a proxy population that matched their engineered social structure to validate their narrative.
Yes, Doug's historical breakdown points to the formulation of the Ashkenazi or rabbinic state Jew relying on matrilineal descent. Historical data indicates that defining Jewish identity strictly by the mother was not the standard during the First or Second Temple periods. It was a later rabbinic formulation, solidified in texts like the Mishnah Kedushin 3:12.
And this rabbinic formulation gained dominance roughly around the same time the Western Church was solidifying its power in the Middle Ages.
The proxy alignment is mechanically perfect. The Church adopts a matriarchal definition of identity to fuel its slave economy, and simultaneously elevates a proxy Jewish population that also utilizes a matriarchal definition of identity. Both systems successfully moved the source of identity away from the father's law and relocated it to the mother's status.
But Doug points out a much darker reason for this alignment, doesn't he?
He does. Doug argues this alignment was necessary to whitewash the existence of the actual genetic Hebrews, the peripheral, often black and brown populations scattered across the Mediterranean and North Africa. If the church encountered genetic descendants of the covenant who maintained strict patrilineal descent, their very existence would threaten the church's entire theological and economic narrative.
Right.
Therefore, according to Doug's audit, those patrilineal populations had to be erased, forcibly converted, or trafficked into the matriarchal slave system.
This is where Doug calls checkmate. This is where Andrew's logic completely runs out of road. I mean, Andrew throws around heavy philosophical terms in the debate to avoid doing the actual historical accounting. He claims to be defending the Father's house, but Doug's audit reveals he's actually defending the state's nursery.
Yeah.
He claims to be the champion of biblical morality while willfully ignoring the absolute law of Sinai that condemns man-stealing as a capital offense. It is a category error of civilizational proportions.
Doug concludes that Andrew is not a defender of biblical truth. He is acting as a matrix manager. He is essentially functioning as a public relations director for a bankrupted Roman simulation, trying to justify its exploitative mechanics using divine vocabulary.
Let me stop you there because I want to pivot this entire conversation. Let's imagine a listener is hearing all of this theology and history and thinking, okay, that's deeply academic, but I care about results. Let's pretend the theology doesn't matter. Let's strip away the moral arguments entirely. Let's unpack this from a purely mathematical, macroeconomic standpoint. Does Andrew's subjugation model actually generate lasting wealth? Does it build a sustainable civilization?
To answer that, Doug brings a devastating economic audit to the table. He introduces what he calls the Carthage butterfly effect.
Let's set the scene for this. The year is 146 BC. The Roman Republic has just defeated its great rival, Carthage, in the Punic Wars.
At this moment, Rome had a civilizational choice. They could have integrated Carthage, they could have established them as a vassal state, turning them into a massive economic partner and trading hub.
But they didn't.
No, they didn't. They chose what Doug calls the Andrew model.
They salted the earth. They destroyed the Carthaginian infrastructure, dismantled their trade networks, and brought an estimated 150,000 Punic survivors back to Rome as enslaved human capital.
And in a debate vacuum, Andrew would likely argue, look, they won a just war, they took POWs, they extracted labor. This is rational, pragmatic statecraft. But Doug runs the macroeconomic numbers on what that decision actually did to the Roman economy. By importing massive, unprecedented amounts of subsidized labor, Rome engineered a catastrophic consumer void.
Explain the mechanics of a consumer void. I mean, if I'm building an empire, having 150,000 free labor sounds like an incredible economic advantage. How does Doug argue that free labor bankrupts you?
Because of the economic multiplier. Slaves do not innovate, they do not start competitive businesses, they do not pay taxes into the public treasury, and most importantly, they do not purchase industrialized goods. They are a permanently non-consuming population.
So if you are an elite Roman senator, sure, having 1,000 slaves working on your latifundia, your mega farm, looks fantastic for your personal ledger in the short term. Your profit margins are huge. But for the nation as a whole, you have just displaced your entire free citizen farmer class.
Exactly.
The independent plebeians, the backbone of the Roman economy, simply couldn't compete with the zero-cost labor of the mega farms.
They lost their land, migrated to the urban centers, and became entirely dependent on the state dole. The infamous bread and circuses. Doug projects a staggering data point here. He calculates that by destroying Carthage and fully committing to a massive slave economy, Rome traded away a potential early industrializing Mediterranean economy.
What kind of numbers does Doug put on that?
He projects that an integrated Mediterranean trade network could have generated between 1.2 trillion to 3.5 trillion in modern GDP terms.
Wow.
Instead, Rome chose a stagnant extractive economy that ultimately resulted in an estimated 200 billion GDP loss. They literally burned the seed corn of global civilization for short-term elite profit.
And Doug argues this mathematical reality guaranteed Rome's eventual bankruptcy. He points to the critical threshold of 350 AD. By this time, the Roman population had become an ethnic and economic ghost.
They had replaced their free reproductive citizen soldiers with a non-reproductive, heavily exploited slave class, the rotten dog meat trade, essentially. They lacked the strategic, domestic reserve of native legions required to hold the borders of an expanding empire.
So when the Great Migration of the Germanic tribes began, Rome was already a hollow empire. The transition wasn't an overnight military defeat, it was the collapse of an internal structure that had rotted away centuries earlier. As Doug vividly puts it, the Germanic tribes didn't even have to conquer Rome. They just walked into a house where the owners had sold their own children into slavery to buy more land they couldn't defend.
You are trading your own demographic future for the temporary high of subsidized labor. And Jarg doesn't just leave this in antiquity, he draws a direct mathematical parallel to the American plantation model.
This brings the audit right to our modern doorstep. Doug argues the southern U.S. economy prior to the Civil War was built on the exact same Andrew model. Millions of human beings were intentionally kept as a permanent second class.
From a macroeconomic standpoint, intentionally keeping a massive percentage of your population in fields, legally prohibiting them from reading, innovating, or purchasing goods is economic suicide. Doug estimates this subjugation model ripped at least $50 trillion in projected wealth out of the nation's future.
50 trillion. Every single person kept as chattel was a mind, not building a factory, not writing a piece of software, not inventing a medical tool. The opportunity cost is unfathomable.
So when we audit Andrew's logic on the spreadsheet, he fails just as spectacularly as he did in the theology. Andrew believes he's being tough and realistic by advocating for subjugation. But Doug's analysis shows he's actually advocating for the destruction of economic complexity. Andrew defends a deficit model.
It's a model that provides a massive temporary wealth transfer for the 1% elite, but mathematically guarantees the eventual collapse of the broader civilization. He prefers the illusion of ruling over a stagnant graveyard rather than navigating the complexities of trading with a vibrant, peer-based economy.
This brings us to the final analytical phase of Doug's deconstruction. He calls this atheist light and the history of losers. We must address the ultimate metaphysical contradiction in Andrew's stance.
The core question is, how does a self-proclaimed Christian, someone who vehemently defends objective morality in a YouTube debate, justify treating human beings like biomass on an accountant's ledger?
Doug explains this through a concept he identifies as the baptismal paradox. Under the Trinitarian Roman-influenced systems that Andrew's historical models rely on, the church would baptize enslaved people.
Which theologically is a profound admission. I mean, to baptize someone is to officially recognize that they possess a soul, a nefesh chea, capable of receiving grace. It is an acknowledgement that they are created in the imago Dei, the image of God.
Precisely. But Doug points out that legally and economically, that same system would simultaneously deny their humanity in order to keep them classified as chattel, as property. They would formally recognize the soul for the afterlife, but they would appraise, trade, and breed the physical body like livestock in the present.
That cognitive dissonance is wild. As Doug argues, this legal framework basically suggests that God is merely a cosmic contractor who respects Roman property law over his own creation decree. It's a system of magical thinking designed explicitly to soothe the conscience of the master while ensuring the cash flow of subsidized labor is never interrupted.
This is why Doug synthesizes Andrew's entire position as atheist light, or as he brutally puts it, secularism in a mitre. Doug calls Andrew a part-time Christian.
Secularism in a mitre, that is a sharp critique, but based on the mechanics we've just outlined, Doug's logic holds.
It holds because if you treat a human being merely as a biological machine designed for labor extraction, you are practicing functional materialism. You are operating entirely on a secular Darwinian calculation of calories inputted versus labor units extracted. Doug argues that Andrew's model relies entirely on extracting wealth through physical dominance, and he simply drapes religious vocabulary like objective morality over what are purely materialistic, atheistic transactions.
Andrew's fear of a demographic shift, which is really just a fear of economic inefficiency or the loss of cultural dominance, vastly outweighs his fear of the law of God, which explicitly commands strict justice and integration for the stranger. And to prove this isn't just theory, Doug provides a historical scoreboard for this audit of subjugation. Let's look at the empires that actually tried to implement Andrew's model.
First, Doug points to the Umayyad Caliphate. They attempted to implement a subjugation tax on converts known as the Mawali. They treated non-Arab Muslims as permanent second-class citizens, specifically to extract revenue.
And the mechanical result: total treasury exhaustion. It triggered the massive Abbasid revolution, and the empire fractured into centuries of warlordism.
Next, look at the Axis powers in World War II. They utilized a literal, scientifically quantified biomass calculation implementing massive, state-sponsored slavery, starvation, and extermination.
And they were absolutely crushed. Why? Not just through military strategy, but because the coalition that defeated them, however imperfectly they operated, leveraged the economic multiplier of free industrial cooperation. Free labor, driven by agency and innovation, outproduces and out-innovates slave labor every single time the two systems clash.
Finally, Doug points to the colonial empires of Europe. They engineered an extractive, global apartheid system across Africa and the global south. They treated entire continents merely as sources of raw materials and subsidized labor, rather than developing them as economic partners.
And the result of that model was the geopolitical pressure cooker that violently exploded into World War I. You had multiple European empires scrambling to subjugate overlapping territories, creating a massive paranoid arms race. And the long-term result: post-colonial ruin and the modern economic stagnation of the very European powers that tried it. As Doug's numbers suggest, they erased 1 billion potential customers just to keep 1 billion low-margin laborers.
This exhaustive historical record leads Doug to present what he calls the immutable choice. It is an ontological zero-sum game. Doug argues that in a universe governed by an absolute reality, you really only have two choices when a civilization interacts with another demographic.
Choice one, you wipe people out completely. Total genocide, which is an absolute moral and spiritual catastrophe that results in the salted earth of the soul.
Choice two, you make them economic peers. You integrate them as partners under a shared standard of justice. This is the only model that activates the economic multiplier and prevents the 350 AD structural collapse.
Doug's ultimate point is that there is no sustainable third way. You cannot engineer a system of permanent subjugation, a permanent second-class citizenship. Andrew's in-between model, his defense of pragmatic slavery and state-managed demographic control, is a historically proven suicide pact. It is a system that eventually cannibalizes its own people to feed the state machinery.
It is, as Doug says, a history of losers. Every civilization that followed Andrew's subjugation model is either dead, fractured into irrelevance, or sitting in a museum. The only powers that remain viable are the ones that realized they had to abandon biomass calculations and move toward economic peerage.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's bring this all the way back to the promise we made at the beginning. We said we were going to decide who won this debate based strictly on the strongest, most exhaustible chain of logic. And based on the source materials provided, the conclusion of this audit is undeniable.
The Trinitarian debater Andrew absolutely trounced his unprepared liberal guest on YouTube rhetorically. He exposed the guest's lack of moral grounding perfectly, winning the localized skirmish.
But under Doug's exhaustive, deep-think logical audit, Andrew's entire worldview implodes. Doug possesses the vastly superior chain of logic because his framework actually survives theological, historical, and economic scrutiny.
Exactly.
Andrew's logic bottoms out because he relies on massive category errors, he ignores the explicit mechanics of biblical law, and he advocates for an economic model that has a 100% failure rate over 5,000 years of recorded history. Doug concludes that Andrew is not defending biblical truth. He is merely acting as a marketing manager for a bankrupt Roman simulation.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over. We've spent this time discussing ancient empires, Roman latifundia, and historical slavery, but look at our modern data-driven world.
Yes, how does this ancient audit apply to us right now?
Ask yourself, are modern tech algorithms and global economic systems still secretly running these exact same biomass calculations? When a platform harvests your data, your attention, and your creativity without treating you as an economic peer, are we, as modern users, effectively being treated as subsidized labor in a digital landscape?
It's a chilling thought. Are we being stripped of our imago Dei, our creative essence, just to feed the ledger of a new 1% elite sitting in Silicon Valley instead of Rome?
It is a profound question of whether we have actually escaped the Roman simulation of extraction and subjugation, or if we have just updated its software. Have we moved from physical shackles to algorithmic ones?
When you look at the house of our modern society, does it just look good on the outside while the foundation is rotting away on a deficit model of human capital? Are we engineering our own 350 AD collapse? That is something you have to audit for yourself.
Thank you so much for joining us in the deep dive today. Keep questioning the consensus, never settle for a localized rhetorical victory, and never stop seeking the actual accounting behind the rhetoric. We'll see you next time.